What's up, guys? Doug Polk here, and today we're going to be breaking down a hand that I played in the recent heads-up duel versus Daniel Negreanu. This, of course, is a heads-up poker hand, and I want to break down some of these hands because in just about a month, I am launching my updated heads-up no-limit course. The last time I released a course, it was based on the strategy that I used to come up through the ranks over the years, but I had never used solvers to know things for sure. Well, this course is the exact opposite. It's going to be a highly technical course. You're going to get the exact ranges and flop sizes to be using, solver breakdowns for later streets, the way we can approach these things and creating heuristics that we can use in our play, and basically how to play poker in heads up no limit at the absolute highest level. However, I do think this course will also be very useful for you if you play other forms of poker because you'll understand range construction, and there are definitely some wide range spots where a lot of these concepts are going to apply. If you're interested in learning more about this course, I'll put a link in the description below so you can check it out. It's going to come out in early October. But on that note, let's go ahead and jump into the action. It is weird coming here and like this isn't my home, Raise.
Yeah.
After so many years of that.
4.
We raised to 4.
Little baby suited connector.
This is why we play the game.
A lot of good years here.
We want to play 3-bet pots with suited connectors. Here we go.
We begin the hand about 235 blinds deep, and we open up the 5-4 clubs. Quick note on pre-flop sizing, I make it 1,000 to go. If you want to get really precise, as stacks get deeper, you want to go bigger and bigger on the button. It's possible that the correct raise size here will be more like 1,100. As you get closer to 60K stacks, 50K stacks, it might move down to 900. When you get under there, it might even go a little bit smaller than that. But the point of the matter is this is roughly the right raise size. You don't have to be super down to the chip accurate, but I want you to know that as you get deeper, you do open to a larger size on the button. Negreanu makes it 4,000 to go over a 1,000 open. This is actually just a little bit too big pre-flop. The opposite thing happens when you're in the big blind. You want to make your raises smaller as you get deeper. I know that's against conventional logic, which was as you get deeper, you want to cut down on their implied odds. But the thing is, what's more important is as you get deeper, the button just wins more money. So you want to keep the pots smaller rather than trying to prevent hands from seeing flops. Just basically what the math ends up being. So Negreanu makes it 4,000, not too crazy big or anything, but I'd like to see the size be slightly smaller here. Back over to me with 5-4 clubs. Actually, one quick note about Ace Jack here. Ace Jack in this situation is not a hand that will always 3-bet. Actually, we'll go ahead and take a look at some 3-betting ranges real quick. This chart shows what an optimal 3-bet range would look like on around these stack sizes, maybe a little bit deeper. But the point of the matter is you can see Ace Jack is only 3-betting 0.6. That means 60% of the time. So Negreanu actually will flat pre-flop with Ace Jack more than you might assume. As a quick note, on 100 big blinds, Negreanu would always 3-bet this hand. But as you get deeper, these offsuit Broadway hands perform worse. They tend to flat more. They do worse versus 4-bet. So essentially on this stack size, Negreanu should mix in some calls, but you definitely want to mainly be 3-betting. Both lines are totally fine. Over to my call versus this 3-bet. Again, this is versus an optimal size 3-bet. Negreanu's range is slightly large, so it'll be a little bit tighter than this. But the point of the matter is 5-4 suited is mainly flatting. 79% of the time you're going to be flatting. It actually does 4-bet 21% of the time. As you get deeper, these hands make nice 4-bets because your playability improves. Basically, you get some nice boards to be able to barrel. Your equity versus the high pairs with a hand like 5-4 suited is better than a hand like Queen Jack or something like that. So these suited connector kind of hands do 4-bet more as you get deeper. I'm sure I 4-bet a quarter of the time or something like that in game. I guess it's possible I pure flat. But basically, this hand gets in there every now and then with a 4-bet, but mainly does just call, which is what we do. And let's take a flop.
Well, Doug does have position, and he's got a bang up flop. Double gutter with the straight flush draw to go with it up against top pair. Strap in.
Okay, let's just end it right here.
Half pot C-bet from the 3-better pre. Daniel.
Raised to 12,000.
And the kindling has been lit here. 3x raise with all of that equity, as you can see.
The flop comes ace of diamonds, 7 of clubs, 3 of clubs, and Daniel decides to go ahead and bet 4,000 to 8,000 with his top pair middle kickers. So I want to talk about a couple of things here on the flop. I play only single size flop, which means I have one specific size that I will be using when I do bet the flop. I think Daniel does the same as well, but I'm not entirely sure. So we're going to just approach this from a perspective of using an optimal single size. If you're using an optimal single size, Daniel's size of half pot is not a very great size. The reason is that it's simply too big to allow you to value bet with hands like kings, queens, and jacks. And if we look at the total value of this strategy, you can see that out of position, their pot share would be 4660 chips when they use the big size. And if you use a small size, like I'm recommending, something like 22% pot, the value is 47.1. So basically you make about 500 chips more, or sorry, 50 chips more when you use the smaller size. So it's not the end of the world. You can definitely use either one. But one of the things I like about the small size, the 22% pot rather than the 50% pot, is this is what the flop c-bet range looks like for Daniel if he uses the size he used. And this is what it looks like if he just does the 22% pot size. So basically, if you go small, like I'm recommending, not only do you make more money, but you also can just bet every single hand, and there's nothing that the button can really do about it. Because of this, it is a much easier strategy to play and is a higher value strategy to play. I would strongly recommend doing this over what Daniel did here on the flop. Going back to Daniel's size that he did use, ace-jack would quite often be betting here, but it would do a check about 20% of the time, 25% of the time, 30% of the time, depending on the combo. You can see the ones like ace-jack with a jack of clubs actually check almost half the time, whereas the ones with no club are a little more likely just to bet and get some value. Also, when you have a diamond, you're a little less likely to bet because you block some calls that are backdoor flush draw kinds of hands. So ace-jack with the jack of diamonds doesn't like betting as much as ace-jack, jack of hearts. I know it seems kind of nitty and not that important, but these small differences between these hands are actually something that matter when you're creating your strategy. And if you're going to try and play poker at a really high level, you want to be thinking about blocker and unblocker effects as you pick your randomization as you go through a hand. Anyways, so Daniel does bet 400, and one thing that Daniel successfully did here was he kind of knocked me off of playing a correct strategy, because all of the work that I've done on boards like this assumes that your opponent is going to bet a really small size, which Daniel did not do. He bet half pot. Because of that, the button does almost no raising. If we look here, when I decided to raise to 12,000 on the flop, I don't have almost any raises. In fact, I would only be raising 1.4% of the time. Typically speaking, when raise frequency gets below 2 or 3%, you don't really lose that much by never having raises at all. And that's definitely what I would recommend to do here. So I think while if I look at 5-4 of clubs specifically, it would always call. If we look at the EV of the raise versus the call, they're very, very similar. But the point of the matter is when sizes get big on flops like this, your opponent is much more polar. It makes way less sense for you to be raising. So I do think that this raise on the flop, while very close, is a mistake. To give you guys an example of why I did what I did, if your opponent bets the small size, and we look at the small blind does, you do lots of raising, with the idea being you can't let your opponent just bet really small and knock you off a bunch of equity. You need to fight back, get value, get your bluffs in, and work all these ranges together. Versus the small bet, 5-4 of clubs will raise about a fourth of the time. So there's a good principle here that I use, which is this hand does fit into a raising strategy, but I did miss the main strategic concept here, which is as that flop size from your opponent gets bigger, no raises end up getting used. So that is going to make the rest of the hand a little bit weird because we're out in the wilderness in a line that shouldn't really happen. But this is what raises would look like if they used a small size. Anyway, back to the hand. I raised to 1,200, and now over to Negreanu. What should he do facing this raise? He actually does do a good chunk of 3-betting on the flop. The strong aces like 3-betting, pocket 7s and 3s like 3-betting. These are not proportional to weight. This is just giving you an idea of what the strategy should be. red is raise, green is call, and blue is fold. So basically, if Negreanu has any ace, he's going to at least call or raise. If he has a pair, the strong pairs are more likely to call. The weaker pairs are more likely to do some folding, like 8s, 9s, 10s. The stronger aces are more likely to just call. So I do think ace-jack here, it does actually do some bet 3-bet, but only when you have the jack of clubs. I don't mind just never doing this and only calling, but I do think as you get closer to ace-queen, ace-king, you have to put some uncomfortable bet 3-bets in on the flop. Anyway, Daniel does decide to just call, and let's take a turn.
56% the favorite with 2 to come. Now, no longer the case as the king of spades rolls off. Daniel, having called the extra 8,000, checks it over to Doug. 32K in the middle. And Brent, is this the point where we check back and look to realize the equity assuredly, or do we continue to apply pressure? Because a lot of what calls us after we raise on this flop is the ace-x combos.
It could be there, could be present, but Doug would play, I assume, a set in a particular fashion, right? He's got a high equity hand, but if the plan is to go barrel, barrel, blast, well, to the moon we go.
$21,000 into that 32, and Daniel calls once more.
The turn comes the king of spades, and Negreanu checks as he should with all of his hands. And now the action is over to me in position. So this is what my bet range should look like. I put in some various sizes so you can see what size is optimal to use. I went for a geometric pot bet, so I bet 21K, trying to make the turn bet the same roughly size of pot as the river. As you can see, the solver would only really use that given the constraints of a big bet, a small bet, or the geo bet. It will only ever use the one that I use, so I feel quite good about my size here. As for my hands exactly, 5-4 of clubs, and I felt this in game, it feels a bit awkward because if I bet 5-4 of clubs and I get jammed on, it is a complete disaster for my hand. Because of that, I felt like maybe I should be doing some checking. I forget in the moment if I did all bet or randomize. I assume I randomized some checkbacks. But you want to be a little bit more polarized when you do bet the turn. It doesn't feel like it's that bad for you if you bet 9-6 of clubs and get jammed on. You're okay to bet fold that. But if you have 5-4 of clubs, bet folding is a complete disaster for your hand. You're almost just priced in to have to call, but it will be quite close. Because of this, the solver does not bet when it has 5-4 of clubs, even though you have a very strong holding. If we want to break down the EV difference, it's kind of similar to the flop. Betting and checking, not too far off. The bet value is 1609, the check value is 1644, but it is a mistake. It's a little bit better to be checking here than it is to bet because you do not want to have to bet fold your equity. So when we look at other kinds of hands that like betting, we can see if we decided to raise the flop with some ace queens, those will bet the turn when we don't have a club. If we have ace 7 or a set, those hands are pure barreling the turn. At least sets are to try and get value. And then we can see some other bluffs here. Few club kinds of hands getting in there every now and then. I know it seems crazy to see jack 9, no club, just barreling here. And the reason that's in there is because you basically never have it. So you can kind of just ignore those. The main hands to think about in this spot are the 5-3 suited hands are going to be nice bluffs. You raise those and barrel because you block 2 pair and sets. And then some of these straight draws hands are getting in there as well. Pocket 4 is making it in there as well. And then, of course, your value. Very, very slim range here because we do not have flop raises, so take this with a grain of salt. Over to Daniel with ace-jack on the turn. He really doesn't do anything here other than call. There's no frequency of raising with ace-jack, but sometimes ace-queen and ace-king will raise, particularly ace-king when you do not have a club does like to raise the turn some. Pocket kings always raises the turn with the idea being you want to try and get value and let your opponent not realize their equity. Kings with the club likes to raise all in if you have club diamond. I don't want to get into suit combos too specifically, but you can see here that basically there is a good chunk of check raising for the big blind. About 8% of hands going for check raise here, 8 or 9% of the hands. Anyway, ultimately Negreanu decides just to go for the check call, which he should always be doing, and let's take a river.
There's 74,000 out there, and now the clubs come in for Doug. Any deuce would have done the trick. And in fact, the non-club deuce would have been preferred. But here we are with a second check in front of us. And an actual hand, as opposed to the 5 high we held on the flop in the turn.
Daniel, I believe, is sick right now.
All in.
He knew this was coming. The club
Probably gonna
is
use
a
time
problem.
bank thingy. I think they'll be annoyed if I pay off and then we're done for the day. Let's see.
Well, it isn't really about how annoyed anybody else might be, but more so
10 seconds.
how annoyingly
These are a minute, right?
depleted Daniel's bankroll would be by 100 grand.
Daniel knows that he was setting up a river shove. It's just trying to process, would he have barreled a hand like this on the turn, rather than realizing the equity that you mentioned, Ali? And that's the predicament that we're in.
I mean, there are some ace-x combos with clubs that are available, although I do feel like those hands would be more inclined to flat the flop. Brent?
Flat
Changed my
flop,
mind, I think. I was
maybe
gonna
had
pay.
4-bet pre with the ace wheel variety. We can remove
Although,
ace deuce, obviously.
The river comes the beautiful deuce of clubs. We have hit our flush, although the offsuit deuce would have been slightly better, a little more disguised. Either way, we have gotten there. Daniel checks it over to us. Not too much to really talk about here. If we do have 5-4 clubs, we're pure jamming. I guess the question might be, what would be the thinnest that we go for value? Some pretty weird stuff starts to happen here. Because we can have flushes so often, even hands like sets are going to do a chunk of checking back here. And this kind of boils down to, we just have such a specific range that's able to raise this big on the flop and barrel the turn. But basically, some sets are able to go for value, pocket threes, a little bit of sevens, but more or less, you're going to be a flush or nothing when you decide to jam here. The bluffs are going to be hands that raise with a club, but you have almost none of those. You know, guys, when ranges get this specific, it's not even really worth going into, because basically this hand is off the rails because of my flop raise. But I guess what I will say is, if you are going to have raises, this is why you need to have some bluffs in there, right? Like a hand like, you know, if you did have Jack 10 with a club, sometimes that needs to bet the turn so that you're able to jam when you have the club on the river. This is why it's important to construct your ranges well on earlier streets, and why you should not take lines that have very, very few hands in them, because it will be very hard to be balanced. I really don't even think it's possible I could be balanced here. I don't think I would look to raise many of these hands versus the flop side. I think I'm just like basically exploitably value heavy here, and I don't entirely know what I can do about it other than not raise the flop. Yeah, because you just can't raise Jack 10 off and just barrel and be profitable with that. Anyway, back over to Negreanu. Difficult situation for him for sure, but when he has ace jack, no club, he basically just always folds. The solver will once in a blue moon go for the call. I think exploitably, your opponent really has to have some bluffs that they prepared here, like, you know, a queen, a club in their hand just to get to barrel off. I have definitely had some hands like that, even versus Daniel. I can think of one in a 4-bet pot where I raised a flush draw flop with king of clubs, and I just barreled off when the club got there on the river. But the point of the matter is, you got to be playing a pretty sick animal to even debate calling here without a club. I just don't think there are enough hands that could really make sense to bluff with, and you really have to prepare for that on an earlier street. So I do think that check folding river is the best play for Daniel. Let's go ahead and see what he does.
10 seconds.
And we remove it based on the lack of a 4-bet pre, or
Yeah.
the turn barrel,
Good fold.
maybe.
I think he was thinking about
oh my God! I was like,
backdoor diamonds.
I was gonna call not clubs, but I thought to myself, he could have 4-5. I beat 5-6. Would he have aces up?
It would be getting a little dicey.
I didn't have a club either. I had ace jack.
Oh yeah, I see.
If I had a club, you might have just got it.
I almost laughed. Just started laughing when you said, "Well, if I call and we go home," I'm just imagining how much effort went into today.
Yeah.
That's a wrap, everyone. Thank you for watching.
You know, I'm a team player. That's why I folded. You got screwed because it happened too early.
If you enjoyed this hand, you can watch daily PokerGo content highlights on their YouTube channel at the link below. And you can also watch PokerGo's entire offering of live streaming and episode releases from the World Series of Poker, high stakes poker, and much more, including Heads Up Duel, at a link below as well. You can check those out if you're interested in more of this content. And finally, before I go, once again, if you want to learn more about my upcoming Heads Up course, the link's down there as well. Thank you guys for joining. I'll see you again soon.